If you clicked on this video, then I'm guessing you have a pretty good idea of where I'm headed with this, but let me start by filling in a little bit more detail. To make a long story short, I think rock and metal have basically lost the plot. Obviously, the genre is way less popular now than it was, say, 20 years ago, but I'm actually not here to talk about album sales and commercial success like I usually do. What I want to talk about today is the actual art itself, because there was a time when rock and metal were very arguably the most innovative genres on the planet in terms of both the music itself and the ideas behind it. Whether that was Jimi Hendrix just completely transforming how people thought about guitar back in the 60s, or grunge basically rebooting music, fashion, and pop culture like basically overnight when Nirvana blew up, or all the other moments in history that you can think of. For decades, rock and metal were really at the forefront of things like that. But think about it. It's been quite a while since rock and metal had one of those moments, right? I mean, yes, of course, legacy bands are still selling out shows. And of course, there's bands like Sleep Token who are having a moment here and there. But again, I'm not talking about commercial success. What I'm asking is, when was the last time that you saw a rock or metal artist have the kind of cultural impact that they used to? And what I think it really comes down to is that rock and metal are boring now, in terms of both the music itself and the ideas behind it. So let's talk about exactly what happened, or at least my take on it, and what the future of rock and metal might be, if there even is one. And also, I want to thank Lumen for sponsoring this video. If you're trying to lose fat and get leaner, then listen up. If you're lifting, doing cardio, and your diet is on point, tracking your macros, calories, all that, but you're still not getting the results you want, well, the reason might have to do with your metabolic flexibility, which is where Lumen comes in. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. With just one breath first thing in the morning, Lumen can measure your metabolism, and it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs. Lumen lets you know what's happening in your body in real time and builds you a personalized health plan based on that real-time data. First, Lumen gives you daily macro recommendations, meaning protein, carbs, and fat. Then, right before a workout, just breathe into Lumen, just like this, and it will tell you if you're burning carbs or fat. And that biofeedback will help put you in the optimal state to get the most out of your workouts. It's not going to turn you into the Rock overnight, but in the long run, these small changes really add up, and it makes all the difference when you're trying to lose excess fat, gain muscle, or just be healthier. So if you want to take the next step to a fitter, healthier version of you, just go to lumen.me/punkrock or click the link below, and you will get 15% off your Lumen. And in order to explain what I mean here, first, let me just back up a little. Like I said earlier, rock and metal have a very long history of being at the forefront of musical and cultural innovation. First, it shook things up in the 50s in pretty much every way you can imagine, pushing all kinds of musical boundaries and challenging all kinds of social norms. For example, Elvis Presley getting censored on TV because his dancing was just too sexy for the American public to handle, and revealing how just uptight and prudish 1950s American culture had become. And that, of course, continued in the 60s with all the hippie music protesting the Vietnam War, but also rock bands entering this era of wild experimentation. For example, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album, or my personal favorites of this era, the Beach Boys.
I'm gonna keep well my vegetables.
And then after that, punk bands in the 70s, basically flipping music on its head and showing everybody how bloated and soft it had become, in terms of not just music, but kind of pop culture in general. Like, this was 40 some years ago, but punk was so revolutionary that it still has direct impact on some of the most influential music of today. For example, like Playboi Carti referencing the cover of Slash by The Damned. And then in the 80s and 90s, alternative culture once again pretty much transformed music and pop culture in general when grunge blew up. This story has been told a million times before, but it's true. The world was never the same after alternative and grunge bands like Nirvana, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Nine Inch Nails blew up, and basically tore down the facade that was 80s and 90s mainstream music, where everything had become just very polished, plastic, and perfect. And then after that, of course, we had nu metal, which was easily the biggest touch point in rock for an entire generation, the millennials, and is still the most popular genre of metal. Like, it's not even close. And again, incredibly influential on all kinds of highly respected artists of today, like, for example, again, Playboi Carti or Lil Uzi Vert, and the list goes on. And whether you like it or not, after that, there was the emo scene of the 2000s, which was written off at the time as sort of a flash in the pan, but I think has actually stood the test of time time, and proven to be another one of those really transformational youth culture moments, with a whole new generation of kids getting into it now that were probably not even alive when it was in its prime. But here is where I think things really started to go off the rails for rock. Probably the last big thing in rock, if you can even call it rock, is all the 2010s indie stuff like Mumford & Sons, Black Keys, and Lumineers, and all that stuff.
I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart.
And as you can probably tell from my tone when I'm describing it, although that stuff was very popular, I consider that sort of moment in time to be a sign that rock had officially run out of ideas. And I'll explain exactly why in just a few minutes. But before I do that, first let me just kind of back up and talk for a minute from sort of an overall philosophy of art perspective, because that's really the important part of this video. And for context, I was a graphic designer for the first half of my career. I went to school for it. I took a ton of art history classes, and I've managed creative teams for about 20 years now. So thinking about this kind of thing has literally been the way that I've paid the bills for my entire adult life. And in a lot of ways, I would consider myself more of a visual art person than a music person. And so I like to apply a lot of the ways that people talk about visual art to music. And for the context of this, I think that we can think about art along two dimensions, formally and conceptually. And when I say talking about art formally, that means literally just the form of the art itself, like the actual characteristics of it, meaning the way that it looks or feels or sounds, how big it is, and so forth, like the actual physical characteristics. And when we talk about the conceptual dimension of art, really what that means is the context around it, like everything other than the formal characteristics, like what the piece of art is trying to say, why it's significant in the context of its movement, why it's significant in the context of its art form, and why the artist chose to make it. And the important thing to understand here is that these two dimensions are completely independent of each other. Something can be great formally and terrible conceptually, or vice versa. And I'll give you a few examples of non-musical art to kind of show you what I mean. And on the upper left here, we have art that is formally strong but conceptually weak. And to me, an example of that is the movie Pulp Fiction. And the reason I say it's not very strong conceptually is because the story itself isn't really that special. There's no kind of big idea or statement that it's trying to make, but the formal characteristics of the movie are incredible. Meaning that like the writing and the cinematography and the music, the costumes, like all of that is just so damn good on its own that it really kind of doesn't matter that it's conceptually maybe not the best. On the other hand, on the upper right here, we have a movie like Tenet, which I would almost consider like an update to his earlier movie Memento. And in my opinion, Tenet is formally interesting because it's just absolutely beautifully made from like the perspective of the craft of movie making, other than the inaudible dialogue, but that's a whole other discussion. But I think it's also conceptually interesting because it's sort of deconstructing the structure of film itself, meaning that it has this very non-linear structure within the inherently linear structure of a movie, which to me is pretty interesting. And on the bottom right, we have things that are conceptually interesting, but formally maybe not so interesting. And I think a great example of that would be Andy Warhol's movie Empire, which is an 8-hour movie that is nothing but a single unchanging shot of the Empire State Building as time passes. And Empire is a movie that you probably wouldn't want to actually watch because there's like literally almost nothing there on a formal level, but it's a very interesting avant-garde piece of art on a conceptual level because the actual art here isn't really the movie itself. The real art here really is fucking with the audience who came here expecting to be entertained like they would be from a normal movie. And so the concept here is really flipping the expectation of the medium of a film as a piece of entertainment to Warhol just completely rejecting that expectation, in the same way as Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which was when he took a off-the-shelf urinal and put it into an art gallery as a piece of installation art, and in doing so really questioned the fundamental assumptions about fine art back in the 1910s. Again, on a formal level, it's literally just a urinal that somebody put in an art gallery, not very interesting formally, but conceptually it asked a lot of really fascinating, challenging questions. And on the bottom left, we have stuff that's neither strong formally nor conceptually. For example, something like Big Bang Theory.
Bazinga.
And I think in this case, you can really even barely call that art. It's really just more of like a television entertainment product that just sort of happens to share some characteristics with actual art. And my point here is that with the exception of the stuff in the bottom left, I think, any of these can be potentially valid perspectives from which to create truly brilliant, interesting, challenging, and valid art. And by now you can probably see where I'm headed with this, which is that I think rock has really slowly drifted towards the bottom left of this chart over time. And I'll explain what I mean here. Basically, if we apply this same framework to music, this space here on the upper right, this is the space that rock used to just completely dominate, where it was continuously innovating on both a formal and a conceptual level. For example, like I mentioned earlier, the Beach Boys. They pioneered this whole idea of pop music as art, which today is very commonplace, but back then was a very new, challenging idea. And they started all of that back in the 60s with albums like Pet Sounds and Smiley Smile, which had these just insanely elaborate, lush arrangements, full of huge layers of vocal harmonies, horns and strings, and all this stuff that just really took the genre of pop to a whole new level formally.
Love is here today and it's gone.
And that in itself was actually a pretty interesting statement. The idea that pop music could be art, not just a product that would be consumed by teenagers the same as Big Macs or Diet Coke or whatever, which is how people saw pop up until albums like Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's. I would also put 9 Inch Nails in this category, who introduced industrial music to the mainstream. And that itself was interesting on a formal level, in that it added all these new sounds to the palette of rock, like synths and samples and so forth. And yes, obviously I know that people did this before 9 Inch Nails, but they were clearly the ones who popularized it on a mainstream level. And introducing those sounds into the genre was interesting not just on a formal level, but also on a conceptual level, because this really questioned the fundamental definition of a rock band as being composed of just bass, drums, vocals, and guitar. And that's something that may not sound like a big deal, but if you look at how people talk about technologies like auto-tune or drum samples even now, this is clearly something that is still a pretty challenging idea. And on the lower right, we have all the artists who have done something that isn't necessarily that impressive on a formal level, meaning that the actual elements of the music itself in their performances may not have been mind-blowing sort of on their own, but when you consider them in context, what they did made a powerful statement on a conceptual level. For example, Nirvana. They played pretty straightforward rock songs, right? Great songs, of course, I love them, but I wouldn't say that they were necessarily all that groundbreaking on a purely musical level. And the same thing goes for another example in this category, which is the Ramones. And actually, I would argue that Nirvana was doing the same thing as the Ramones were on a conceptual level, which was to come along at a time in which music had become soft, bloated, and phony, and basically come along and just give it a big kick in the ass. And for context, remember that when Nirvana came out, this song was number 2 on the Billboard charts.
It's about that time to break forth the rhythm and the rhyme. I'ma get mine, so get yours.
So for them to come along and just be this like really raw, stripped down kind of garage rocky band, wearing thrift store sweaters and ripped up jeans, that in itself was actually a huge statement that changed the world forever. And as a less mainstream example, I would put the band Sun in this category. Or maybe more accurately, the band Earth, since Sun essentially copied their sound, but nobody knows who Earth is, so I'm going to use Sun here. And if you're not familiar with them, they're a so-called drone metal band that basically makes songs that sound like this for like 5 to 20 minutes. And to me, this is maybe the perfect example of something that's formally weak, but conceptually brilliant. I think of Sun as really the musical equivalent of an abstract expressionist painter like Mark Rothko, who, if you're not familiar, did paintings like this or this. And what I mean by that is that Rothko's paintings are his attempt at representing not reality like you would see from sort of a traditional painting of like a bowl of fruit or whatever. He's not trying to represent that. What he is trying to show here is the most pure expression of human emotion, basically unchained from the burden of having to depict some sort of recognizable object. What he wants is when you walk in front of this giant black rectangle in the museum, that you feel the crushing weight of despair and depression that he felt when he was making it. And Sun, I think, is basically the musical equivalent of that. It's purely about setting a mood and an emotional tone, freed from the burden of having to make any sort of conventional songs. Now, where, in my opinion, things really start to falter for rock, and especially for metal, is up here in the upper left, where it's formally strong but conceptually weak. And the two examples I'll share here are Dream Theater and Limp Bizkit. And let me explain what I mean by that in a bit more detail. In the case of Dream Theater and a lot of other metal bands like say, Megadeth, the appeal is almost purely on a formal level. Because really the entire point of the music is like, hey, listen to how good we are at guitar. And yes, I'm aware that Dave Mustaine shoehorns some like really cringy, bad political lyrics into this stuff, but really that kind of only reinforces my point. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, with making art that's sort of about the technical aspect of creating it, or making music that's just all about playing guitar really fast. But in my personal opinion, that's just not very interesting art. It's kind of like when you see someone who does these like amazingly intricate, super detailed photorealistic paintings. Like you can certainly appreciate how much time and effort goes into developing the level of technical ability to paint that well. But when you look at that stuff, it's not actually really interesting to look at, right? It's just like, wow, okay, your painting looks like a photograph of a parrot. That's cool, but so what? It's really just kind of a neat party trick, but it sort of falls flat as art because they don't actually have anything to say. And also in this corner, we have stuff like Limp Bizkit, or I would say also Foo Fighters, both of which are objectively well done rock music and certainly enjoyable to listen to, but it doesn't really have anything to say on a conceptual level. So I think it just falls into the category of what I would call entertainment, in the same way as you would go see like Fast and Furious 14 or the new Marvel movie.
You don't turn your back on family.
And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's totally valid to make stuff for just pure entertainment, and I like watching popcorn movies just as much as the next guy. But in the same way as I think most people would agree that Fast and Furious 17 isn't necessarily bringing anything new to the table or creating any kind of like interesting art, I'd say the same is true for the music in this category as well. And this is where I would put a very, very large chunk of newer bands, if not almost all of them. For example, on the rock side of things, you have bands like The Warning, Highly Suspect, or Mammoth WVH.
Breathing in all the madness around you, feeling like it's the end of days.
And all those bands do their thing very, very well. And I think all of them would be like perfectly fine as the soundtrack to a summer day, but they're really not bringing anything new to the table or saying anything super meaningful. And I think you can see the results of that, because none of this stuff has really broken out of that like summer rock festival kind of scene and become a part of larger pop culture like rock bands did back in the 90s and 2000s. Like, when was the last time that a rock band had any sort of a cultural moment like, say, Lil Nas X or Taylor Swift have? Been a while, right? And on the metal side of things, I think it's maybe a little bit better, thanks to bands like Sleep Token, who I think are doing something kind of new on a formal sense with their mix of like prog metal and pop. But I'd still say that the vast majority of metal fits into this category. Very impressive on a technical level, but really that's about it. I think of that stuff as like if you're a writer with the biggest vocabulary in the world, but with nothing to actually say. Just kind of a waste. And on the bottom left, we have music that's not really interesting conceptually or formally. It's just kind of over there existing. I would almost think of this more as like content than art, if that makes sense. Which, getting back to what I was talking about earlier, is where I would put the last big thing in rock, which was that whole like 2010s stomp, clap, hey, indie rock kind of thing. Like Black Keys, Mumford & Sons, Lumineers, and all that. And obviously this stuff made a ton of money, so someone was listening to it and liked it. But the fact that this stuff became car commercial fodder like almost overnight says a lot to me about its merits on, I guess, an artistic level. And if this was the last big thing in rock, which, unless I'm missing something, it was, like, honestly, that's kind of sad. And I don't really see any signs of that changing. For example, if you look at any of the playlists on Spotify that are supposed to be like cool new rock bands, there's stuff like Bad Flower, Greta Van Fleet, and Idols, which people keep telling me are great and amazing and you're gonna love it. But then I listen to it and it sounds like this. And I'm like, really? This is what you're holding up as an example of like great, amazing modern rock? To me, there's just absolutely nothing here that's interesting in terms of the music itself on a formal level. And on a conceptual level, I don't really see anything there either. Like, this whole wave of newer rock bands certainly is not making any kind of a statement like the hippies or grunge or nu metal or even emo did. They're just kind of safely existing over here doing their thing in all the summer rock festivals. And like I said, I just don't really see that changing anytime soon. I see nothing that makes me think there's like some big wave of new ideas coming out of the the rock scene just around the corner. If anything, I would say it's gone backwards. For example, I absolutely loved the emo rap scene of like 2014 to 2018 because it was such a fresh take on alternative music. Like on just a formal level, it was super interesting because they were doing things like putting trap drums together with a 3 Days Grace sample and with vocal melodies that were like half Blink-182, half Chief Keef. And conceptually, that was also really cool because it sort of did the same thing as Nine Inch Nails, meaning that it just sort of questioned all these fundamental assumptions that people had about alternative music being a thing that you had to make with a traditional band of bass, drums, guitar, and vocals. But for whatever reason, the emo rap scene sort of ended up going backwards. Most of these guys stopped making these cool, innovative emo rap songs and started making, in my opinion, kind of generic pop punk that sounds like Blink wannabe bands from 2003, and that pretty much killed my interest in the genre. And so zooming out, I think that somewhere around maybe like the early 2010s, I think rock just kind of lost the plot and ran out of ideas. And in hindsight, the beginning of the end was probably back in 1992 when Dr. Dre came out with The Chronic and pretty much instantly made hip hop and specifically gangster rap the coolest genre of music on the planet. But still, rock held its own for a solid 10 or 15 years after that. But since then, if I want to find something that is new and interesting on a formal or conceptual level, I'm not looking to rock for that. I think hip hop and pop have been much more interesting and experimental than rock for a long time now. And they've really stolen a lot of the energy from what otherwise I think would have been the rock scene. As maybe the most obvious example, all the kids who were Playboy Cardi stans in 2024 would have probably been emo or nu metal kids 15 or 20 years ago. And you can see the same thing with, I guess, what you would call alternative pop, like all the sort of artists in the 100 Gex, Charlie XCX kind of world. And like I've talked about before, how K-pop has really become the new emo. Basically, all the creative and fan energy that would have gone into rock years ago now has been siphoned off into these other genres that are a lot more interesting. And so the question is, what's next? My honest opinion is that rock is just out of gas. And that's honestly not even really a criticism because the genre is something like 80 years old now. And we can't really expect anything to last forever, right? Or at least not stay on top forever. For example, in the world of movies, Westerns were the most popular genre for decades until they sort of started to get overtaken by sci-fi. Or as another example, jazz. It was one of the most interesting, innovative genres of music from maybe the 40s through the 60s, but eventually it also slowed down. And now I think it's probably rock's turn to ride off into the sunset, or at least pass the baton, to just totally mix metaphors. Now, I certainly don't think rock is going to just disappear completely from the face of the earth, but I do think rock's time as the place where interesting and exciting new ideas come from is over. And honestly, I'm not sure what else could possibly even happen. With 80 years of history and this insane amount of experimentation and innovation already behind it, what else is really there that's left to do? Haven't we just kind of completely explored the limits of rock? Like, you're never going to write a better blue-collar anthem than Bruce Springsteen. You're never going to write a better pop-punk song than Green Day or Blink. Or do lo-fi experimental pop songs about organic vegetables better than the Beach Boys did. And I don't think you'll ever do anything more extreme than, say, AC or Last Days of Humanity. So what's left to do? I would say not much, if anything. So if it's time to say goodbye to rock, well, I think it had a pretty damn good run.